The battlefield was a war zone like no other. The roar of the tanks reverberated through the ground, shaking the earth beneath them. Dust clouds swirled in the air as the relentless thud of artillery echoed in every direction. The soldiers, clad in the dark fatigue of war, moved with a sense of urgency, fear creeping into their hearts as they heard the approaching rumble. The smell of burning oil and scorched earth hung thick in the air, mingling with the distant cries of the wounded. At that very moment it was clear. This was not just another battle. The fate of nations would be decided here in the blood-stained dirt of Kursk. Tanks clashed, artillery blasted, and thousands of lives were thrown into chaos. But amid the chaos, one fact became undeniable. This battle would change the entire course of World War II. Could it be that this single confrontation was the turning point of the entire war? The Battle of Kursk wasn't just another fight in the sprawling conflict of World War II. It was a defining moment in the war's history, a massive confrontation that would forever change the balance of power between the Axis and Allied forces. Taking place from July 5 to August 23, 1943, near the Russian city of Kursk, this battle saw over 6,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, and more than 1.5 million soldiers clashing in what is considered the largest tank battle in history. At its core, it was a brutal, desperate attempt by Nazi Germany to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, following their catastrophic loss at Stalingrad. But what made Kursk so significant wasn't just the scale. It was the strategy, the timing, and the personalities involved. The Germans, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, were hell-bent on a decisive victory. Adolf Hitler, still determined to crush the Soviet resistance, ordered a massive pincer movement to surround the Soviet forces, hoping to replicate the success they had achieved at earlier points in the war. The Germans believed that breaking through Kursk would allow them to regain control of the initiative in the east, pushing the Soviets back and ultimately weakening their resolve. On the other side, the Soviets were ready. Under the leadership of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army had learned from their earlier mistakes. They had time to prepare, fortify, and even deceive the Germans into thinking they were less prepared than they actually were. By the time the Germans launched their attack, the Soviets had dug in, creating multiple defensive layers that stretched over 150 miles of land. They had also amassed a powerful force of tanks and soldiers to counter the German assault. The result would be a clash of titans, one side with superior tactics, the other with better technology, and both sides determined to determine the fate of the Eastern Front. Kursk was more than just a battle of tanks. It was a war of attrition. It showcased how modern warfare was evolving and how technological advancements, such as the German Tiger and Panther tanks and the Soviet T-34, would change the way wars were fought. It also highlighted how intelligence and strategic planning could tip the scales in battle. The Soviets had cracked the German codes and were fully aware of the German plans, a key element that gave them an edge in the early phases of the battle. The Battle of Kursk, while not the war's final chapter, was undeniably one of its turning points, and its outcome would set the stage for the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. The sheer scale of the battle and the intensity of the fighting would leave a lasting impression on all those who participated, and ultimately it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But how did a single battle manage to change the entire course of a war? Let's dive into the details of this monumental confrontation. To understand the significance of the Battle of Kursk, it's essential to grasp the broader context of the Eastern Front during World War II. By the summer of 1943, the war had reached a critical juncture. The Germans, having suffered heavy losses in battles like Stalingrad, were increasingly on the defensive. The Soviet Union, though battered, was no longer the same vulnerable force it had been in 1941. The German blitzkrieg had slowed, and the Soviets were not just holding their ground, they were pushing back. The strategic importance of Kursk was undeniable. Located in the heart of Soviet territory, the city of Kursk was a critical junction, with multiple railroads converging there, making it a key point for the Germans to strike if they wanted to regain control of the Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler, unable to accept defeat and still desperately clinging to the notion of a quick victory, ordered a massive offensive to regain momentum. The German strategy was twofold: destroy the Soviet forces surrounding the area and open a path to further advance into the Soviet Union. The German commanders, particularly Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, envisioned a pincer movement. One group of German forces would push from the north, while another would attack from the south, encircling the Soviets in what they hoped would be a decisive blow. The offensive was meant to achieve two objectives: weaken the Soviet forces in the region and ultimately break their resistance, thus crippling the Soviet war effort. However, the Soviets weren't caught off guard. In fact, by the time the Germans launched their attack, the Soviets had been preparing for months. They knew that the Germans were coming, thanks to their highly effective intelligence network. This wasn't a case of the Soviets blindly reacting to an invasion. They had studied the Germans' every move. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the Soviet Union's most respected commanders, orchestrated a brilliant defensive strategy. The Soviets had fortified the area with multiple layers of defense, digging in deep with trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches. They also deployed thousands of tanks, including the iconic T-34, which had undergone continuous improvements, making them formidable opponents to the German forces. At Kursk, the Soviet leadership's decision to prepare for the German assault rather than attempting to preemptively strike back would prove crucial. Their fortifications and preparedness created a defensive structure that would exhaust the German forces as the battle dragged on. The Germans, despite their superior technology, underestimated the resolve and ingenuity of the Soviet defenses. What they thought would be a quick, decisive battle turned into an extended conflict that would test both sides' strategic willpower. This wasn't simply about tanks clashing on a field. It was a clash of two very different military strategies, one based on the belief in rapid, overwhelming force, and the other on deep layered defense and counterattacks. Both sides were fighting not only for victory in Kursk, but for control over the future of the war itself. The stage was set, and the world would soon witness one of the most intense, transformative battles in history. But in the end, who would come out on top, the attackers or the defenders? The morning of July 5, 1943, dawned with a sense of quiet before the storm. On both sides, commanders braced for what was about to become one of the largest and most intense tank battles in history. The Germans launched their attack at dawn, a wave of armored might advancing toward Soviet lines, eager to break through and encircle the defenders. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's pincer maneuver was in motion. From the north, the Ninth Army advanced, while from the south, the 4th Panzer Army aimed to hit the Soviets in their vulnerable flanks. The Germans were confident. After all, their tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, were equipped with the most advanced weaponry. Their artillery was formidable, and their commanders believed that speed and firepower would once again carry the day. But from the moment the Germans began their advance, they encountered fierce resistance. The Soviet defenses at Kursk had been meticulously planned. The Soviets had set up deep, multi-layered defensive positions ranging from anti-tank ditches to heavily mined areas. The Germans were immediately confronted with Soviet T-34s, which had evolved since the early stages of the war. These tanks, while not as heavily armored as their German counterparts, were fast and maneuverable, giving them an edge in the open terrain of Kursk. Soviet tank crews, familiar with the battlefield, were able to use the terrain to their advantage, ambushing the Germans from hidden positions. As the German tanks advanced, the first clash occurred at the city's outskirts. The ground shook as artillery shells exploded, and the roar of tank engines filled the air. The iconic German Tiger tanks, with their powerful 88mm guns, struck fear into the Soviet troops, but the Soviet T-34s held their ground. The Tigers' heavy armor made them nearly invulnerable to smaller Soviet guns, but their slow movement and fuel consumption were major drawbacks. Meanwhile, the T-34s, lighter and faster, could strike from unexpected angles and keep the Germans off balance. The battle became a brutal exchange of firepower and tactics. For every German tank that fell to Soviet fire, another Soviet tank was destroyed by the precision of the German artillery. The air above the battlefield was filled with the deafening roar of aircraft as both sides sent their bombers to wreak havoc. But while the Germans threw everything they had into the attack, the Soviets continued to regroup and counterattack, slowly bleeding the Germans dry. What the Germans failed to anticipate was the resilience of the Soviet forces and the depth of their preparations. The longer the battle raged, the more evident it became that the Germans had underestimated the strength of Soviet defenses. With each passing day, the cost for the Germans grew, not only in terms of tanks and planes, but also in terms of morale. The Soviets were far from defeated. They were adapting, countering, and waiting for the right moment to strike. As the days wore on, the Germans' initial momentum began to stall. The once unstoppable juggernaut of German tanks had become bogged down by Soviet tactics, terrain, and unyielding resistance. The scale of the fighting was immense, but it wasn't just about numbers. The Soviets had mastered the art of defense, and they had turned Kursk into a nightmare for the German forces. As the Germans pressed on, they were drawn deeper into the Soviet trap. Would the Germans be able to break through the Soviet lines, or had they underestimated their enemy one time too many? By mid-July, the Battle of Kursk had escalated into a brutal war of attrition, with neither side willing to give ground. The initial German offensive had stalled, but the Soviets were also far from claiming victory. In fact, the Soviets had not only withstood the German onslaught, they were now preparing to go on the counteroffensive. What had initially appeared to be a German triumph was starting to unravel. On July 12th, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov, a series of counterattacks that would eventually turn the tide of the battle in their favor. The Germans, bogged down in the fight, had no choice but to retreat slightly in some areas, but their position remained far from secure. The Soviet forces, however, now had the advantage of surprise. They had kept their preparations hidden and used the terrain to their benefit. The German tanks, once so powerful, now found themselves fighting in terrain that worked against them: thick forests, narrow fields, and heavily fortified Soviet positions. This gave the Soviets an edge, allowing them to attack from unexpected angles and use their more maneuverable T-34s effectively. The psychological effect on the German forces was immense. What had started as an assault full of promise was rapidly becoming a nightmare. German commanders, seeing their forces bogged down and casualties mounting, began to lose hope. Their Tiger tanks, though formidable, were running low on fuel and maintenance. The immense size and firepower of these tanks, which had once been their trump card, were proving to be liabilities in the chaos of the battlefield. Meanwhile, Soviet tank units, though less heavily armored, were mobile and capable of quick maneuvers that kept the Germans off balance. By the end of July, it was clear that the Germans had lost the initiative. The Soviets had not only held their positions, but were now pushing back with full force. The Battle of Kursk had turned from a desperate German offensive to a catastrophic retreat. Over the course of a few short weeks, the Germans had expended massive amounts of resources, and the Soviet counteroffensive had successfully shattered their hope for victory. The battle now stood as a clear symbol of the shifting balance of power on the Eastern Front. But while the Germans were retreating, the Soviets were not out of danger. The success at Kursk was not an easy victory. It had come at an enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died, and much of the land had been reduced to rubble. Even though the Germans had been forced to retreat, the war was far from over. The battle might have been a Soviet victory, but it set the stage for even more intense fighting. In the aftermath, the Soviets realized that while they had dealt a massive blow to the Germans, their own losses were staggering. However, they had successfully halted the German advance, and this shift marked a turning point in the war. Kursk was the beginning of the end for the German offensive on the Eastern Front. But the real question remained: could this victory at Kursk truly signal the collapse of Nazi Germany? Or was the war still far from decided? The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of soldiers, it was also a battle of technology. The world had entered a new era of warfare, and Kursk became the proving ground for cutting-edge innovations in tank design, artillery, and air power. Both the Germans and the Soviets brought their most advanced technologies to the battlefield, with each side believing their own weapons would give them the edge. However, the outcome of the battle revealed how these technological advancements would shape not only the battle, but the future of the war. On the German side, the Tiger and Panther tanks were the crown jewels of their armored forces. The Tiger, with its massive 88mm gun, was a fearsome weapon, capable of knocking out almost any Soviet tank from a distance. The Panther, though slightly lighter, was equally deadly, with a faster rate of fire and superior mobility compared to the Tiger. The Germans were confident that these tanks, along with their advanced artillery and air support, would give them the upper hand. And in many cases, the Tigers did strike fear into the hearts of Soviet tank crews. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, and their firepower could annihilate most Soviet tanks from long range. However, these technological marvels had limitations. The Tiger was slow and prone to mechanical issues, and its fuel consumption was enormous. In the vast Russian steppe, where the distances were immense and the terrain was treacherous, these tanks often became bogged down. Worse still, the Germans' reliance on heavy tanks meant they had fewer lighter, more mobile units to exploit breakthroughs or respond to changing situations on the battlefield. While the Tiger and Panther were devastating in direct combat, they were not invincible, especially when faced with the overwhelming numbers of Soviet tanks and infantry. On the Soviet side, the T-34 was the real game-changer. The T-34 had been in service since 1940, but it had undergone continuous improvements, especially in terms of armor and armament. The T-34's sloped armor made it harder to penetrate, and its 76.2mm gun was more than capable of engaging German tanks at medium range. What set the T-34 apart, however, was its mobility. The Soviets knew that speed and maneuverability would be key to their survival in Kursk. Unlike the Germans, who relied on heavy, lumbering tanks, the Soviets made the T-34 highly maneuverable, enabling it to move quickly through the battlefield and outflank enemy positions. Beyond the tanks, Soviet intelligence played a crucial role in their success. The Soviets had cracked German codes and knew about the German plans to attack Kursk. This allowed them to prepare in advance, fortify the area, and concentrate their forces at key points, maximizing their defensive advantage. The Germans, by contrast, were caught off guard by the depth of the Soviet defenses, which were not just physical barriers, but also a psychological defense built on months of preparation and knowledge. In terms of air power, the Germans had superior aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190, but they too were limited by fuel shortages and the sheer scale of the battle. The Soviets, while not possessing as advanced aircraft, made effective use of their air support to harass German forces, limit their mobility, and provide critical support to ground operations. The technological innovations of both sides were tested to their limits during the Battle of Kursk. While the Germans' heavy tanks and artillery were impressive, it was the Soviets' adaptability, intelligence, and the mobility of their T-34s that ultimately made the difference. Kursk highlighted the importance of not just having the most advanced weapons, but knowing how to use them in the right circumstances. It wasn't always the most powerful tank or weapon that won the day, but the one that was used most effectively on the battlefield. The Soviets had proven that, in the end, technology alone wasn't enough to secure victory. It was how you used that technology that truly mattered. The question remains, would the Germans ever recover from the technological and strategic blow dealt to them at Kursk? Or had the battle revealed the limits of their technological superiority? The Battle of Kursk was not just one of the largest tank battles in history. It was a mind-boggling testament to the scale and intensity of warfare during World War II. The numbers behind this battle are staggering, offering a glimpse into the sheer madness of the conflict. More than 1.5 million soldiers participated in this monumental clash, with over 2,700 German tanks and 3,600 Soviet tanks pitted against one another. This immense battlefield stretched across an area of over 300 square miles, with tanks, infantry, and aircraft filling the land in what seemed like an endless contest of firepower, strategy, and willpower. The sheer number of casualties during the battle adds to the overwhelming scale of the conflict. Over 200,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, many of them caught in the devastating crossfire between tanks and artillery. The destruction of equipment was equally staggering. The Germans lost roughly 1,000 tanks, while the Soviets lost around 2,000 tanks, illustrating just how costly this battle was for both sides. The scale of this loss wasn't limited to tanks alone. The Luftwaffe, Germany's once dominant air force, was stretched thin, losing over 400 aircraft. The Soviets, too, lost a significant number of aircraft, though their losses were somewhat mitigated by the greater numbers and their ability to replenish resources more quickly. Artillery fire also contributed to the overwhelming scale of the battle, with more than 4,000 artillery pieces used across the front lines. Both sides unleashed devastating barrages, with the Germans hoping to break through Soviet defenses and the Soviets working tirelessly to repel the invasion. The intensity of the bombardments turned the landscape into a nightmarish terrain of craters, shattered buildings, and twisted metal. Perhaps one of the most shocking statistics of the Battle of Kursk is the sheer duration of the fighting. The battle lasted over 50 days, from July 5 to August 23, a sustained period of violence that drained resources, morale, and manpower on both sides. This long, drawn-out conflict highlighted the brutal nature of World War II, where battles could stretch into weeks, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. In total, it's estimated that over 1.5 million men participated in this epic clash, an unfathomable number in the context of one single engagement. The numbers alone tell a grim story. A battle of unrelenting intensity where the loss of life, machines, and resources was staggering, yet neither side could claim a clear, definitive victory for weeks. The human cost was colossal, and the ripple effects of this battle would reverberate throughout the war. As both sides exhausted their resources, the question remains, with such staggering losses, who truly won the Battle of Kursk, and did the scale of the destruction shift the momentum of the war permanently? The aftermath of the Battle of Kursk reverberated far beyond the immediate carnage on the battlefield. For both the Germans and Soviets, the consequences of the battle would reshape the course of the war, with effects that stretched well into the future. While the Soviets could rightfully claim a victory, the battle's true impact lay in the shifting strategic dynamics of the Eastern Front. Kursk marked the definitive end of Germany's ability to launch major offensives in the East, sealing their fate in the war. For Nazi Germany, the battle's outcome was devastating. The German forces had poured enormous resources, men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery, into the attack, and by the time the Soviets launched their counteroffensive, the Germans were already on the defensive. The failure to break through at Kursk exposed several cracks in the German war machine: the overextension of their supply lines, mechanical failures in their heavy tanks, and the unanticipated strength of the Soviet defenses. What had initially been planned as a decisive blow to the Soviets turned into a catastrophic defeat, and the German forces were forced to retreat. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been decisively repelled, unable to push forward or make further gains. It was a bitter blow to German morale, and after Kursk, the Germans would never regain their footing on the Eastern Front. The loss at Kursk also highlighted the increasing difficulty Germany faced in maintaining their war efforts. They were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, and their ability to replenish lost equipment was dwindling. The production of tanks like the formidable Tiger and Panther, while initially a game-changer, proved unsustainable. The costs of maintaining these machines were enormous, and by the end of the battle, German industry had exhausted much of its ability to provide replacements. More importantly, the Germans had now lost the initiative. Every major offensive they launched afterward would be in response to Soviet advances. On the other hand, the Soviet victory at Kursk gave them a major psychological and strategic boost. The Soviets had not only repelled the Germans, but had also forced them into a retreat, a rare and significant shift in the dynamic of the war. The battle proved that the Red Army could not only withstand the might of the Germans, but could decisively defeat them in open battle. It marked the beginning of a series of successful Soviet offensives that would eventually lead them to Berlin. The loss of more than 200,000 soldiers was a heavy toll for the Soviets, but the victory at Kursk fueled the Red Army's momentum, propelling them forward in their drive westward. The battle also had long-term political implications. The Soviet Union, bolstered by their success at Kursk, solidified their position as one of the most formidable military powers of the time. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East, and as the Soviets continued to advance, they slowly dismantled the Nazi war effort piece by piece. But despite their victory, Kursk did not mark the end of the war on the Eastern Front. The fighting would continue for nearly 2 more years, with countless more battles, offensives, and retreats. Yet Kursk was the pivotal turning point. It was the first time the Germans had been decisively stopped in a large-scale confrontation, and the Soviets had proven they could defeat the German military in direct combat. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Germany's dream of conquering the Soviet Union was shattered, and the Soviets now had the confidence to push the Germans back all the way to Berlin. As the Soviets looked to their next moves, the battle at Kursk set the stage for what would become the final push toward victory. The Germans, meanwhile, faced a grimmer reality. Their defeat at Kursk had sealed their eventual downfall. Would the Soviets continue to build on their success and march toward Berlin? Or would the Germans somehow reverse the momentum of the war? One thing was certain: Kursk had altered the course of history. Looking back at the Battle of Kursk, it's clear that its significance transcends the numbers and the tactical maneuvers that defined the day. While the battle itself was an intense clash of tanks, artillery, and sheer willpower, it was the strategic consequences of Kursk that ultimately changed the course of World War II. This battle, with all its bloodshed and devastation, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in the East and represented the moment the Soviets truly turned the tide in their favor. The Germans, after Kursk, were no longer in a position to dictate the terms of the war on the Eastern Front. The failure of their offensive, despite the massive commitment of resources and manpower, exposed critical flaws in their strategy. The loss of their elite tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, and the exhaustion of their forces meant they couldn't press further into Soviet territory. The German war machine, once feared for its speed and efficiency, had been decisively checked. From Kursk onward, the Soviets would take the initiative, launching a series of successful offensives that pushed the Germans back to Berlin. The Battle of Kursk wasn't just a Soviet victory on the battlefield, it was a psychological victory that shattered the Germans' confidence and weakened their ability to fight back. For the Soviets, Kursk was a turning point that would resonate throughout the rest of the war. The Soviet victory at Kursk was more than a military triumph. It was a testament to the resilience of the Red Army. The battle showcased not only the effectiveness of Soviet defenses, but also their ability to turn the tide with the right intelligence, preparation, and strategy. Despite heavy losses, the Soviets gained momentum, and their ability to recover from defeat was proven once again. The successful counteroffensive at Kursk would propel them forward, eventually leading them to the heart of Nazi Germany. Yet, as monumental as Kursk was, it wasn't the final battle. While the Soviets had shattered the Germans' offensive capabilities, the war on the Eastern Front would continue for nearly 2 more years. The Germans would launch several more offensives, but their ability to sustain a major campaign had been crippled. The battle highlighted an undeniable truth. While individual battles like Kursk could shape the immediate future of the war, it was the long-term strategic decisions that ultimately decided the fate of nations. As history looks back on Kursk, one question remains. Could this battle have been the moment that sealed Nazi Germany's fate, or was it merely a single, significant chapter in a larger narrative? Perhaps it was both. Kursk undoubtedly marked the beginning of the end for the Germans in the East. But the war was far from over. The battle showed that victories in war are not solely defined by tactics or technology, but by the perseverance and adaptability of those who fight. For the Soviets, Kursk became the ultimate symbol of their ability to turn the tide of history. For the Germans, it was a bitter reminder that no empire, no matter how formidable, can last forever.